So I have heard my colleagues' statements. I simply note that our troops who are stationed in Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq on the front lines, they're not being killed by nuclear weapons, by directed energy weapons, or by torpedoes. Many of them are getting shot. They're being killed by small arms weapons. And I have this article here that I want to enter into record. It's called Trump's New Gun Export Rules Could Aid Terrorists, Tyrants, and Criminals. And it's from CNN, dated February 14, 2019. If I could enter that into the record. Great.
Without objection.
All right, so let me ask some questions, either Mr. Abramson or Professor Welts. The U.S. has lost weapons that we gave to Syrian rebels and other folks that now end up in the hands of ISIS. Is that right?
That's correct.
And this is under the State Department, and we're going to have even less regulations and less oversight under the Commerce Department. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What we actually would want is more oversight, not less, if these weapons are ending up in our enemy's hands and then they're killing U.S. troops. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
Okay. So, Ms. Reeves, I have a question for you. You had said that a bunch of these weapons could be brought in commercial retail places. Flamethrowers are one of the things here that would be transferred to the Commerce Department, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes,
Do
up
you know
to
if-
20 meters. Yeah.
Right. So, do you know if Dick's Sporting Goods sells flamethrowers?
No, they don't.
That's right.
Not
So
that I
there's
know
actually
of.
items here that you couldn't actually go to a commercial retail establishment and buy, like flamethrowers, correct?
Okay.
Okay. Now, I'm going to reference this article we entered into the record from February. It says that, quote, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which are wagering a brutal war in Yemen that has killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and pushed the country to bring the famine, have, actually thousands of civilians, have aggregately requested by hundreds of millions of dollars of firearms from the U.S. Wouldn't you want Congress to know that that's the case, that countries are going to buy hundreds of millions of dollars of these kinds of weapons? Why would you want Congress to not know that?
Well, for military weapons, Congress will know about that. That is written into the law. And there is the potential for including congressional notifications. That's something that should be worked out between Congress and the Commerce Department.
So you wouldn't oppose that if there was this rule change, that Congress would still be notified of sales over $1 million?
I would have to see it.
Okay. Another part of this article is that the Philippines ordered $22 million worth of guns from the U.S. Professor Welts or Mr. Abramson, wouldn't Congress want to know about that?
Yes, of course it would. I mean, and they should have, actually. And then in the case that I referred to earlier, one of the big problems was that they didn't receive the notification by error.
So now that this proposal is to have a bunch of these weapons go under the Commerce Department's jurisdiction, I simply note that the head of the Commerce Department, Wilbur Ross, do any of you know if he has any military experience? He doesn't have any. He's a banker. And so we're going to have a banker make these kinds of decisions, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I've got another question for either Professor Welts or Mr. Abramson. What was your understanding of the original rationale under the Obama administration for proposing this?
My understanding was it was just part of the broader export control reform initiative, which had this process of changing how things were done and eventually ending up with one list that we never got to that point. But the arguments that this was never raised, no one raised an alarm during the Obama administration, disregards the fact that it was never introduced for us to raise an alarm. We certainly were ready and at that point would have raised this. We've been waiting for many years knowing this was coming. And so to say that somehow this is an Obama era thing and why didn't we raise an alarm really is a false reading of the history.
Thank you. And we just heard from our colleague, Congressman Malinowski, which basically said that he was opposed to it and he was in charge of one of the main offices at the time. Yes. I also want to just make two requests for the consideration of the chair. I do hope that either this subcommittee or their House Foreign Affairs Committee will mark up the legislation that Congresswoman Torres presented on today. I also want to offer for the chair's consideration my legislation called the Arms Sales Oversight Act. Right now, in the U.S. Senate, any member of the Senate can introduce a privileged resolution which would cause a vote on arms sales transfers. We don't have the same thing in the House. This legislation would simply harmonize that, and would request this committee to look at that legislation as well and decide whatever you want to do with it.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Lieu. And
And with that, thank you all for being here, and I yield back.
great. Thank you.